When I first saw Tactical Breach Wizards, I was a little cautious. I worried that the whole Wizards but in modern day would just be a forgettable skin over a generic XCOM clone. But once I started the game, all those worries went right away, in place of a genuinely creative and fascinating world with some truly unique gameplay that utilizes its theme better than I could have ever imagined. The gameplay on the surface looks a lot like what you'd expect from a strategy game. Each mission is comprised of 3 to 5 encounters, which are basically just rooms you need to clear, each starting with you blowing down the door with magic, which is always objectively cool, and I love the little touch of Zahn snapping his fingers to do it. As cool as it is though, it's not as fleshed out as it at first seems. You expect to be able to maybe choose where you breach or who does it with different pros and cons depending on what you pick. But most encounters only have like 1 or 2 locations to breach, and both are usually filled with your squad. I also found little reason to deviate from the default formation it gives you at the start, but once the doors are blown open, there's tons to love about the combat. At the start of the game, we're introduced to Zahn, who is your basic soldier man. He's got a gun go bang bang, enemies die. You can take all of Zahn's abilities, his whole kit, and slot it into XCOM and it'd fit perfectly. But things get interesting fast once you finish the tutorial and recruit Jen, who can't actually do any direct damage herself. But make no mistake, despite Zahn technically being the damage dealer, Jen is your killer, especially early on. Instead of damage, her attacks have a hefty amount of knockback to them. The only way for her to do damage is to knock enemies into walls or other enemies, meaning if an enemy isn't around anything, she can't really do much to them besides just push them around a little bit. Luckily for us, most of the levels take place in enclosed areas with plenty of fragile windows around. Sniper in the distance, giving you trouble? Knock them through a window. Heavy trooper threatening to one-shot you? Give them a little push. In fact, you beat a lot of your enemies by throwing them into or out of something. Windows, walls, portals to a dimension filled with eldritch abominations, barrels. The game is built not around shooting enemies until their health hits 0, that is important, but a lot of my kills and the way I dealt with almost every bigger, more threatening enemy in this game was by throwing them through windows, and it's one of the most satisfying things I've done in a strategy game. If you were one of those people who spent your time kicking people off ledges in Baldur's Gate 3, this game is built almost entirely around that. And because of that, it gets you thinking about the environment more. It gets you to think not only about your positioning, as that determines which direction your enemy gets knocked in, but the positioning of the enemies as well, and how you can use that to your advantage, and how you need to use a lot of your skills to be more successful. Each encounter also comes with these optional challenges for each character, and as someone who plays a lot of strategy games but isn't very good at them, the optional challenges each encounter provides were really fun actually. How do I line everything up to defenestrate 3 enemies with 1 attack? How do I set off my own Overwatch during my turn instead of the enemies? How do I beat this encounter in a single turn? They were genuinely challenging and tested your knowledge of the game and all the characters in your party and got me to use abilities in ways I wouldn't have normally. I really had to use every character's entire kit to accomplish them all. And there is a leveling system that gives you points to increase the effectiveness of your abilities. Some are just straight damage ups, but plenty modify your abilities in interesting ways, like allowing Jen's grenades to refresh your movement, and even the regular damage ups feel meaningful because of how little health everything has. This is one of those games where if an enemy does 1 extra point of damage to you, you feel like you'll never recover from it. And if an enemy has 5 health or more, that dude's a tank. I often found myself agonizing over which skill to get, as levels are somewhat rare for each character and you only get 1 point per level, making it exciting when you do level up. These levels do make some of the challenges easier to accomplish, but there were only a few that I felt like were impossible to do without a certain perk. All the others felt perfectly doable your first try, while simultaneously never making things too easy as well, at least in regards to the challenges, because honestly, if you do ignore the challenges and just try to mainline the game, it can get fairly easy. A lot of my fun, that feeling of being a tactical genius, came from doing the challenges. But that's also kind of great. That challenge exists for the strategy veterans like me, while also being a fun, easy way to learn strategy games for the less experienced, while still dangling that carrot on the stick for them to try doing those challenges, because they reward confidence points, which let you unlock cool alternate outfits. The game also does a really good job of encouraging experimentation through its foresee mechanic, which allows you to see how the enemy turn will play out after yours, and if you don't like it, you can just undo your last move, and the rewind button, which allows you to rewind everything all the way back to the beginning of your turn if you accidentally misclick or misjudge something. So I would often just try out certain skills or new strategies just to see how it would happen, just because I could without the fear of having to restart the entire level all over again. But that still doesn't remove the threat of tension entirely. Rewind only goes to the beginning of your turn, so you still gotta plan ahead, and again, there's the challenges that require you to be at the top of your game. There's also a lot of very clever and creative, almost set piece like levels that manage to feel cinematic without actually having any cinematics. For example, an early highlight has your 2 party members split up and crossing 2 bridges opposite of each other, with the game requiring you to use one character to shoot across and clear the way for their ally, so they can move across and return the favor. It's for one, very fun to do and got me thinking about my situation a little bit differently, requiring me to use a lot more of my skills and to stop focusing on what was immediately in front of me and instead on the wider level. But also it feels ripped right out of a cheesy action movie, as the characters bicker a little bit before splitting up and having to help each other. But you can tell they're still good friends despite all the verbal jabs. All it was missing was the characters competing with each other to see who could get the most kills or something, and then the cheesy action vibe would have been complete. I'm not a huge fan of the heavily cinematic games. I don't necessarily hate them or anything, they're just not for me. But this is the type of cinematic I like because it's all interactive. All the cool action sequences are things you did, moments you set up and pulled off. You're the clever badass, blowing open doors, crashing through windows while throwing enemies out of them and taking names, not the character you're playing. Of course, the game does have a handful of bosses that, in keeping with the more comedic tone, are kind of jokes. They are fun, but a little too easy for their own good. The first boss has you fighting a traffic cop who throws spectral cars filled with skeletons at you, often hitting a third of the room you're in, but he doesn't attack until after you move, so it's very easy to avoid, and it's pretty much all he does. Combine with this series of windows conveniently behind him and you can finish this fight in no time. But they also fit the tone of the game. Our characters are constantly making fun of him, as they should, because he's an evil traffic cop. How could you not make fun of that? Another villain is a pyromaniac whose fire burns with the heat of, well, it's probably not lethal, but you'll definitely want some aloe vera on hand. A lot of the more modern MCU style storytelling has resulted in some genuinely threatening villains being turned into kind of just jokes, but here these villains deserve the sarcastic comments and one-liners undermining their threats, because, evil traffic cop. And when our characters are dealing with the actual main villain of the story, they treat her with far more seriousness, making her feel that much more threatening because of the tone shift. So in a way, the jokes actually make the main villain more threatening, which brings me to the story, which is actually really good, dealing with all these nuanced characters and different governments and religion. Normally when we talk about good stories for indie games, it's a small introspective story about one character going through depression or something, and I like those, don't get me wrong, but Tactical Breach Wizards is like a political thriller, and a good one at that. It expertly translates some real world stuff to its fantastical yet familiar world that had me engrossed. We get to dive a bit into our character's psyche and see some of their hang-ups in life. The world is rife with pretty complex government conspiracies involving stoking hate and zealotry in foreign countries. I'm afraid I'm overselling this, but I really did enjoy it. It is shockingly well written. And it's also pretty damn funny too. The little jabs the characters throw at each other were fun, but I love how one of the core mechanics is throwing people out windows. There are various challenges that require you to throw multiple people out of windows, but they don't say just throw someone out a window. They tell you to defenestrate them. Defenestrate 3 enemies. Defenestrate 2 enemies in one turn. Defenestrate just means to throw someone out of a window. I've never heard that word before, but I find it so funny that they chose to use a fairly fancy sounding word that means something so silly, and my life is all the better for it. Or how unlocking different outfits for all of your characters is contextualized as you already technically owning them. Your character just needs to build enough confidence to wear them, thus the confidence currency for completing challenges. It's all tongue firmly in cheek. And I love all the characters in this game. Zahn and Jen in particular have a great relationship and tons of chemistry between them. Basically, they're like old friends who haven't seen each other in a while and have stumbled back into each other's lives as they try to take down Zan's old partner turned terrorist. And if you've ever had a friend that you haven't seen for years and you meet up again and it's like old times, like you never left, that's their relationship and it nails it perfectly. I love how you can tell right away that they're a little bit fed up with each other's bullshit, but they're still old friends, so they have no real problem with each other. They're all too happy to jump at a chance to make a joke at the other's expense, but you can also tell they know each other's boundaries. The characters aren't just avenues for jokes. The jokes, the sarcasm, the quips do as much to tell you about the characters and their relationships with each other and how they're feeling in the moment as they do to make you laugh. They have flaws and regrets and hang-ups in life, but they care for each other, they help each other. They're just well-written characters, and the other party members you gather all fit in like a glove. Bank's darker, more matter-of-fact style bounces off well with Zahn and Jen's banter, and later another character joins with a more serious, objective-focused personality to keep everyone in line. It all comes together to create one of the more memorable cast of misfits in recent years. We get these optional scenes between characters you can watch. They don't progress the story in any way or anything, they're just there to add a little more context or show some characters' relationship with each other. It's really interesting to see these characters who are all soldiers or detectives just take some time to decompress between missions, to support each other or just get to know each other. I loved these characters and loved learning more about them and their relationships with each other, but it did kind of feel like the whole optional scenes fell a bit by the wayside. There's only a handful of them really, but it's a testament to the writing that I just wanted more. More of just dialogue between characters with no gameplay. I wanted to see these characters just talk to each other. On top of those, we also get these optional missions that pop up periodically through the story that focus on one character and gives us a deeper look into what makes them tick, while also giving us missions that are more like puzzles, focused entirely around that one character's kit. Those were also really fun, and it is very funny watching these characters essentially psychoanalyze themselves. And all of this fits into a fascinating world that I think has a lot of potential for the future. The world on the surface looks a lot like ours with modern cars and buildings, just with the added fact that some people can use magic. But every now and then the game drops little hints, little bits of lore, like how there's been 4 world wars and we're trying to stop the next one, or how mana is confiscated and disposed of like a drug, but governments are holding on to it just in case someone finds a military use for it. I left the game wanting to learn more about the world, wishing I could spend more time in it. Tactical Breach Wizards is frankly an incredible game. The characters are nuanced, the story is surprisingly deep, the gameplay is creative, it is the whole package. It is a blast.